So today, September 6th, is a very special day for me because it is my birthday.
Merry New Year!
However, for the people of North Carolina who requested a vote-by-mail ballot, it's also a very special day for them because today is the day that the local election officials are going to be mailing out their ballots, and they'll be able to vote in the next day or two. So we're actually getting to some real voting in the 2024 election. Now, in the next few days, sometime next week, we're going to actually start seeing some raw vote total numbers to give us an idea of where this election might be going. So we're now getting into the meat and potatoes of the election. Now, with that being said, a lot of people wonder, as far as the Democrats are concerned, how much focus should be put on vote by mail, because back in 2020, we had a lot of people voting by mail because we were in the midst of a pandemic. While the Democrats were at home, really trying to be safe and not wanting to get the virus and get sick, Republicans were tearing down stuff in Targets, right? And pulling a Karen. So they were more likely, the Republicans were more likely to vote in person, and Democrats were more likely to vote by mail. But let's go ahead and break down the 2020 numbers and the 2022 numbers in two states in particular, North Carolina and Georgia. And the reason I don't have any other states really is because the data is kind of iffy in a few of them. So I really wanted to focus on these because they are kind of some of the first states that we'll see with the vote by mail. So let's go ahead and look at North Carolina. Now, if we look at the 2020 Trump voters, we see that only 21% of the composition of Donald Trump's total votes were actually from Election Day, which he won quite handily. He won 65% of that vote. Now, 69% of the composition of Trump's votes were actually early voting, in-person early voting, in which he won 52% of those votes. And only 10% were vote by mail or absentee votes, and he got absolutely trounced in that, only winning 28% of the votes. Now, if we look at Joe Biden and flip the script a little bit, we see that Biden, only 11% of his votes came from Election Day votes. So he doesn't focus as much on Election Day. And of course, he got killed by a 2-to-1 margin in Election Day. Now, when it comes to early vote composition, 63% of Joe Biden's votes came from early voting, which he was very close. He won 47% of that vote. Now, only 26%, even in the midst of a pandemic, only 26% of Joe Biden's votes came from vote by mail, though he did quite well with the vote by mail numbers, winning 70% of that vote. So we can see in the North Carolina numbers right away that maybe the vote by mail in 2020 wasn't necessarily as strong as we think. So they might not have as much of an impact. But let's go ahead and look at the composition of the 2022 election for U.S. Senate and see how that breaks down, because then we don't have the impact as much, or really at all, when it comes to the pandemic. So if we look at the Republican candidate, Ted Budd, who did win the election by about 3%, we see that 48% of his vote came from Election Day voting. That is a lot higher than the 21% Donald Trump had, and in this case, Ted Budd won 59% of that vote. Now, if we look at his composition of early voting, of his vote, of those people who voted for Ted Budd, 49% came from early in-person voting, which means that if we look at the vote by mail composition for Ted Budd, only 3% of his votes came from people who voted by mail. So we can see in this situation that the Republicans are not really going to be relying on vote by mail. But the same thing can be said for the Democrats as well. If we look at Sherry Beasley's vote, we can see that only 34% of her vote came from Election Day results. That's significantly higher than the 11% that Joe Biden got 2 years earlier. And she lost quite handily in that one. Now, in the in-person voting, 58% of Beasley's votes came in-person early voting, in which she won 52% of those voters. So that's extremely strong, especially when that is a big chunk of your votes. And when it comes to the vote by mail, only 8% of Sherry Beasley's supporters came out and voted by mail. Now, she won vote by mail by quite a large number. Very similar, these numbers are very similar to what we saw in the 2020 election. She won 72%. So it's a strong number, but it was only 8% of her composition of the vote. So as we can see here, we can see the vote by mail isn't necessarily going to be the thing that determines a lot of these elections. Now, one thing that needs to be said is when you do have, let's say, 10% of the vote that's going 70 to 30 in a lot of these, that is a significant chunk of the vote. So these numbers are not insignificant, but they're not necessarily the main driving force behind how the Democrats will get their vote in this upcoming election. So I mentioned that I wanted to talk about Georgia. Let's go ahead and flip over to the Georgia presidential race in 2020 and see how that composition breaks down as well. So let's go ahead and look at Donald Trump's 2020 Georgia results. We can see only 24% of his vote came from election day in-person voting, which he won 60% of those voters. Now, the large chunk of his vote was in-person early voting, with 57% of his vote coming from in-person early voting, in which he won 53%. Now, if we look at the composition that he has of mail-in votes or absentee votes, only 18% of Trump voters voted by mail, and he only won 34% of those voters. So overall, we're seeing that this composition of the vote in 2020 in Georgia is very similar to what we saw in North Carolina there, where the early voting seems to be what matters the most. Now, let's go ahead and go to the U.S. Senate race that happened 2 years later. I realize I forgot to mention what Joe Biden's numbers were. Sorry about that. Here's the graphic, so you can just go ahead and look at those in comparison to the others. Now, if we look at Herschel Walker's vote, we see 42% of Herschel Walker's vote came from actual election day voting. That's up from 24% that Donald Trump had 2 years prior, and Herschel Walker won 56% of those voters. Now, 54% of Herschel Walker's voters came from early voting, but he did not win the early vote. Raphael Warnock actually won the early vote, with Herschel Walker only getting 46%. But as you can see here, only 4% of those who voted for Herschel Walker came from absentee or vote by mail, in which he only won 30%. So you can see again, between this 2020 and 2022 election, the reliance, at least on the Republican side, for vote by mail absolutely dissipates. It's basically gone when we're looking at 4% in Georgia and we're looking at 3% in North Carolina. It just isn't a big composition of their vote. But now let's go ahead and look at Raphael Warnock's numbers in 2022 and see how those distribute. So if we look at Raphael Warnock's numbers, we see that only 30% of his vote comes from election day voting, which he only won 41%. So Democrats are going to do significantly worse on election day. So it's important for them to really, really build up that lead before election day. Okay, now if we go ahead and look at the early vote, we can see that Raphael Warnock had 62%, which is significantly higher than Herschel Walker. 62% of his vote come from in-person early voting, in which 53% of those voters voted for Raphael Warnock. So that is important. When it is a plurality, or actually a majority of the vote that is actually cast in the state of Georgia, and you're winning this number by quite a few percent, that's going to be your margin. Now, if we look at vote by mail, we see that Raphael Warnock only had 9% of the vote by mail composition of his actual number. So of those who voted for Raphael Warnock, only 9% of those actually voted by mail, and he won that pretty handily with 68% of the vote. Now, there were other states I was able to get data from, but the way that some of these states do it is a little bit different. So if you are doing, let's say, early voting in some states, it's actually considered like vote by mail, or if you do vote by mail, it's considered early vote. They kind of like clump all the numbers together. So we couldn't get a vote by mail, in-person early vote, and election day voting. We couldn't really be able to parse that out with the other states. But even with that being the case, these trends of seeing the shift to early voting is having an impact, but we are starting to see more and more people vote on election day. But what is the overall takeaway from this? The overall takeaway basically is for the Democrats, vote by mail is becoming less and less. It just seemed to be something that was important during the pandemic. Now, obviously, there are states that mail out ballots to all of those who are participating in the election and who are registered. And with those states, you have a little bit of a different dynamic. But in these states where you don't have that, Georgia and North Carolina, where you have to actually request a ballot, in these states, we do see the dying off a little bit of the vote by mail. Now, what's really interesting is we see the Democrats do quite well with vote by mail, but prior to this, prior to maybe even Obama, but maybe even during the first 2008, 2012 election, vote by mail was considered very strong for the Republicans because a lot of the people who would get vote by mail ballots were people who were in the military, who were overseas, and therefore the Republicans, especially in the 80s and 90s, really dominated vote by mail. But now with the pandemic, this whole thing with bamboo, I don't even know what the latest Republican conspiracy theory is on vote by mail. I'm sure there's about 20 or 30 that I haven't even caught up on, and I'm fine with that. The distrust has made them move to early voting in person and election day voting, particularly election day voting. And this is where it's really, really important because the Democrats will have more and more an early vote, whether it is vote by mail or in person. The Republicans really have to show up on election day. If Republicans don't show up on election day, then they're doomed in a lot of these states. So they are very reliant on election day voting. So you just see a different trend for Democrats and Republicans when they get their votes, how they get their votes. But the vote by mail thing just doesn't seem to be as much of an impact as, let's say, in-person early voting. All right, so I just wanted to go over that because today is a big day in North Carolina. The numbers will give us an idea of maybe which way the electorate is pushing, and hopefully we'll be able to get some data from North Carolina in the next few days or sometime next week. But who knows? We'll see. All right, thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.